everybody. Finish up your awesome conversations. I've been walking around hearing just incredible stuff from you guys. My apologies for the late start. We've got, a lot of moving parts here and a lot of technological stuff that I'm not super good at. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We hope to be able to do more of these and have these types of conversations. As our leadership team got together, we feel so strongly that these types of conversations need to be had. And so send us your ideas if you have any. We've got a little bit of a pool where we're writing them down. So we are going to start out tonight with a prayer and a pledge. So we have Mark, our great treasurer, Hailstone's going to do our prayer, and then we will move on. And I'm blanking. We're going to have Ben do our pledge, and then we will go over a little bit of introductions, some announcements from us of things that you can look forward to, and then we will get on our way, and we'll show you the format for tonight. So let's start with Mark.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for the privilege that we have to gather together as fellow citizens and brothers and sisters, as fellow Americans, to discuss ranked choice voting and how we can continue to build our communities and have conversations on the future of this county, our cities, and ultimately this great nation. We ask Thee that Thy Spirit might be here, that we might have a spirit of debate and camaraderie, that we might learn from each other, and that all of us might be edified and educated as part of this experience. We thank Thee for Thy love, Father, and we say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right. Thank you, Mark and Ben. Appreciate that. So just a couple of quick things that we wanted to talk to you guys about that's upcoming. We have a central committee meeting that is going to be September 16th. So if you're on the central committee, look for that date coming up. It's going to be at Dixon Middle School in Provo. We also, at that same time, after the meeting, we'll have our Ledge District leadership elections. So if you are planning on running, filing will be at the end of August, and we'll put information out about that. And also, we have exciting new things coming on our website. So if you stopped visiting the website because you got a little frustrated, hold on. Please give us a second chance. We're excited about a lot of the changes that we're excited to talk about things that we can do and make it for the party. Also, our social media accounts. If you don't follow us on one of those, Telegram channel is doing super well. So if you're on Telegram, those are the channels, and please follow us on one of those. Okay, so one of the reasons we're here tonight is that we all feel really strongly about freedom of speech, and we currently live in a cancel culture. I am very much against it. I'm a huge fan of John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. If you haven't read it, his opening line is the epitome of all things government. He says that government is the balance between the collective and individual liberty. It's not a destination, and we often run towards a destination, but finding that balance where we have the most freedom. So much wisdom in that book. So he says about freedom of speech here, the peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, those who dissent from the opinion steal more than those who hold it. If the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. I talked to Mark about this, and he goes, I read it twice. The first time I went, huh? And the second time I went, oh, you win when you lose, and you win when you win. And I said, yes, that is the beauty of it, because you correct your errors, and everybody is the better for it. So, in the spirit of the First Amendment, we are here to look at this information, present it in a better light. There's a lot of hyperbole, there's a lot of talk on this subject. And so we're of the opinion that we would like to voice those things and have the conversation. So the format will go like this. Introductions, the openers are 5 minutes per side, presentations, audience questions, and mind you, 1 minute to state the question. So we'll keep to that. And then closers 5 minutes. So if the participants will come on stage, I'm going to turn this over to Chuck, our awesome vice chair, and he's going to go ahead and moderate that. Also, please be patient with any switching over. We've got a lot of PowerPoint presentations, so we might have a little bit of a delay. But if you give them a round of applause, this is not an easy thing to do.
All right, I'm Charles Wood. I am the party vice chair. And really quickly, I'm just going to have us start from, I guess, from the audience's right. So furthest from me, just go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll just move through this way. Oh, do you know how to make your own?
There's a green one right there.
Hi, I'm Nancy. No, it's not. Yeah? Hello. Hi, I'm Nancy Lord. I've been involved in the Utah Republican Party for almost 50 years. Next year, it will be the 50th anniversary of when I started going to precinct caucuses. So I'm a lifelong Utah Republican. I live in Salt Lake County. I am a CPA by profession, and specifically I do auditing for the most part. So I'm very interested in mathematical issues. I was one of the early adopters and promoters of ranked choice voting in the state of Utah in the Republican Party, and we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. But I love ranked choice voting. I think it's fantastic, and we hope that we can express that to you in a way that if you haven't considered the benefits of it, that you'll open your mind to that tonight. Because ranked choice voting was really homegrown among Republican conservatives in the state of Utah. And we're going to tell you more of the details of that. So I think that's
Josh Daniels, former vice chair of the Republican Party here, glad to be part of the vice chair caucus with you, Charles, and Mac. Also served as the county clerk and auditor, overseeing elections. And I've liked ranked choice voting since I was first a state delegate in 2004, and they used it in the party for our nomination process, where I learned about it from Nancy. My background's in public policy. I have a degree in law, and like looking at laws and understanding their impact on our lives.
My name is Mark Roberts. I used to represent District 67 in the legislature, served in the legislature from 2012 to 2020. District 67, Southern Utah County. And I'm done with that. I run a fintech company in Spanish Fork now. And looking forward to this discussion. Christy, thank you for putting this together.
Okay, you hear me? Again, thanks, Christy. This is a brilliant idea. My name is Wendy Hart. A lot of you know me because I was that problematic Alpine School District Board member who hated Common Core and wanted decent math. So that's how I got involved in politics. Was I hated what the math was doing that my kids were learning, and I graduated from that to hating the math with ranked choice voting. So no, a lot has changed. Anyway, I have been spending the last 3 years going around to city councils and groups and explaining the mathematical flaws that I see in ranked choice voting, and we hope we can explain that information to you here tonight. Thank you.
My name is Jason Sneed. I am the Executive Director of the Honest Elections Project and co-chairman of a national conservative coalition called Stop RCV, which is the name implies, as opposed to ranked choice voting. It's a real privilege and honor to be here tonight. I'd like to thank our hosts for putting this wonderful event and for all of you for being here. Just a few years ago, ranked choice voting was something that very few people had heard of, much less were interested in coming to an evening event to talk about. But that is changing all over the country as this issue moves to the forefront of the election integrity debate. And I believe that stopping it is crucial to making sure that we have elections that the public can trust. And so it has been several years now that I have been going all over the country, working with groups at the grassroots level, working with lawmakers and so forth, trying to explain why ranked choice is the wrong choice for elections in America. And I'm very much looking forward to tonight's debate.
I'm going to kill myself. All right. I'd like to thank our debaters for introducing themselves. We're going to move on to the openers. I have a coin. I'm going to flip it. Since you have fewer people, I'll let you call it over here. And then you can decide if you want to go first or last. Sound good? Whoever wins the coin toss. Heads. You want to go first or second? All right, so the pro ranked choice voting folks will go first. Christy will be your timekeeper. She'll wave at you or signal you when you have 1 minute. If you want to stare her down, she might give you other signals, I don't know. But yeah, we'll go ahead and let you give your opening statement. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Charles. It's so fun to be here to talk about the most exciting and important topic in American politics, which of course is federal income taxes in Russia. But they told me we had to talk about ranked choice voting, so I'll try to do all three if I can. So when you think about elections, probably the most important issue is who wins and who loses. It's interesting that our founding fathers were some of the first humans, really, to make significant progress in this experiment of self-government. For generations of humanity, we, as individual people, the plebes of society, didn't always have a say in how our society and our communities were governed. We instead looked to the sovereign. And the sovereign was the guy in charge. And oftentimes the guy in charge told us that he was in charge because the guy upstairs who was really in charge put him in charge of all of us. And after doing that for generations, we decided that the sovereign, and this is documented in our founding documents, that the sovereign in our country was going to be the people. That we, the people, are the sovereign. And that we, the people, will govern ourselves. And we're not going to look to somebody to govern and usurp authority, but that the authority to govern comes from the consent of the governed, which necessitated that we, the people, got together with our voice collectively, and through the voice of the people, Vox Populi, we would decide what we would do collectively. We would perhaps delegate some powers to governing bodies. And we formed this great nation that all of us are beneficiaries of. And the voice of the people was designed to govern our society and our institutions, so that we could really do one really important thing, and that is to preserve liberty for each individual. And so the founders were brilliant in the way that they put a very robust system of checks and balances to check tyranny against the liberty of the individual. But one of the most fundamental protections was that we would choose how we're governed through a voice of the people. There was a famous saying, actually, that came from England, vox populi, vox Dei, which is basically the voice of the people is the voice of God. The idea being that the voice of the people is the sovereign. And that principle was embodied in our Constitution and in our system of government so that we could really truly govern ourselves and protect against the power that might come from one faction that might only represent a minority. Well, when it comes to ranked choice voting, this is important because ranked choice voting does one simple thing. It helps ensure that the winner of an election represents a majority of the people that participated in that election. And unfortunately, commonly in America, the way that our system works today, often elections are decided upon who gets the most votes. That doesn't mean that it's a majority. We don't really know what a voice of the majority of the people want in the outcome of that election. And so ranked choice voting is a simple improvement on the way we do elections that helps to ensure that we have majority winners. And I would submit to you that that is critically important. It is fundamental to this experiment in self-government. It's fundamental to delivering on the promise that was granted through our constitutional system that embodies that the sovereign in our nation is we the people. Is that 1 minute or 1 second? 1 minute, okay, great. So this is why I think ranked choice voting is really easy and simple. Now, is it the best possible election process and system we could think of? Well, no. I think you could theoretically come up with something that might be more complex but somehow better. But it is absolutely an improvement on what we have today, which is a plurality system, where oftentimes the winner doesn't get a majority. And we've seen many examples of that in America. And it's why people have promoted an election process where you rank the candidates. And I would submit to you that, if we play what-if games, had we had ranked choice voting 100 years ago, we probably wouldn't have income taxes or Putin invading Ukraine. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But thanks, it's really great to be here, joined by my friends Nancy, one of the pioneers of ranked choice voting in Utah, and former Representative Mark Roberts, who actually passed some legislation to enable ranked choice voting for city elections. And really, he was seeking to solve a lot of other problems.
So are we framing you as pro RCV and anti RCV, or would you prefer another term?
To rank or not to rank? That is the question.
All right, well, we will hear for 5 minutes from the not to rank crowd.
Okay, so I did have somebody ask how come there are just 2 of us instead of 3, and the reality is that this presentation that I give is usually like an hour and a half long, and so I have so much to say that they didn't figure that we needed to split it up. I just want to say that I am really grateful to have this opportunity to be able to address all of you and to give you the information. As I said, my concerns, I started out kind of ambivalent on ranked choice voting. It was like, all right, that's interesting, and have to look into it a little bit more. But the reality is when I got into the math of it, it's mathematically flawed and it's unnecessarily complicated. And we've actually got data to back all of that up. And so as much as I would really like the other side to be right, because I've wasted a lot of time the last 3 years going around talking to people about it, it still is problematic from a mathematical perspective. The idea is it creates a false illusion of the majority, and in my opinion, it's more important to be transparent that you got 37% of the vote, which was enough to win, but you don't have a mandate. And so if the other checks and balancing portions of the government would have the chance to know that no, you don't have a mandate, and maybe we override vetoes or, things like that. So there are a handful of things where the math doesn't math, as the kids like to say. And with that, I'm going to turn a little bit of time over to Jason to tell you a little bit more.
Yes, thank you. To not rank indeed. I oppose ranked choice voting because it makes voting harder. It turns our elections into black boxes. There is quite a lot of data out there that shows us that it actually discourages turnout and participation, including from vulnerable voters like seniors, minority voters, and others that we otherwise want to bring into and keep engaged with the democratic process. It makes it easier to commit errors and mistakes, and it makes it harder to identify those mistakes, all of which works against what I believe to be the most fundamentally important thing, which is to build confidence in our elections through transparency and safeguards and clear rules that keep voting simple and accessible for every citizen. And yet, despite all of these concerns, and despite how unproven this system is, we are watching a nationwide campaign unfold to push ranked choice voting at the local level, at the state level, and for federal races all across the country. Ballotpedia, which is a wonderful resource, is already tracking this year twice as many bills in legislatures all across the country pushing ranked choice voting than they were last year. And when legislatures don't pass laws to enable or require ranked choice voting, there is a growing movement to go to the ballot. So we're already watching in states across the country, from Idaho to Arizona to Nevada to Ohio to Oregon, ballot measures getting started to push ranked choice voting on our states. Tens of millions of dollars are being spent on campaigns and lobbyists. Where is this money coming from? It is coming from the left's biggest donors. It is coming from George Soros and other people who are working constantly to skew American politics to the left. And I ask you, what advantage does George Soros gain from financing election reform that benefits his rivals? I say none. And if you can find one good reason, then that makes you a smarter person than me. But more fundamentally than that is the fact that ranked choice voting is simply a bad policy at the wrong time. And we are hearing a great deal of misleading narratives about how effective it is, about how useful it has been, or even that it helps Republicans. Now, I can tell you, I unfortunately am not a lifelong Utah resident. I wish I were. I live in Virginia, and one of the narratives that we have heard time and again is that ranked choice voting was used by Virginia Republicans to elect Glenn Youngkin. And I can tell you that is 100% false. The reason that the Virginia Republican Party used ranked choice voting in the 2021 primary was because they had no choice. The Democrats in Virginia refused to let them hold a convention, so they had to do an unassembled convention using ranked choice voting. And you can go look at the receipts. RCV didn't deliver Glenn Youngkin. Youngkin was leading in every round of elimination. The only reason that we used it was because the Democrats tried to force COVID emergency voting protocols on the Republican Party. And I have talked to people who ran that election who say, do not do it. It made everything harder for candidates, for campaigns, for lawyers, for observers, for tabulators. It was a nightmare to run. And I hope that we learn from their lessons and don't repeat that in future elections.
All right, thank you, not too late. The next portion is the presentation portion. You will have 25 minutes. We will go back to the two-ranked team. If you have slides, I'm assuming they're on this computer. I'll go ahead and let you all run them since you have somebody who can talk and somebody who can run slides.
Yeah, you can just click over just one, maybe, spot that's on there. No. Yeah, there should be a drive with just a PDF in there.
All right. I will freely admit that if I'm ranking computers, Windows is not my first choice.
Oh, let's see. Well, good thing you have multiple choices and you can rank them. If they were out of stock, you could always. Here, I do use Windows from time to time, unfortunately. Let's see.
The right one?
Yes. Look at that. Microsoft Office trying to compete with Adobe. We're going to take that Utah County. Doesn't matter. That's okay. That's good enough. Oh, show me. There we go. Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I know that we've got a packed house. There's a big diversity of experiences in the audience. Raise your hand if you have never heard about ranked choice voting or never participated in ranked choice voting in your life. Okay, that's a few people. Okay, that's good. But if you'd like to see how it works, this in that sample straw poll, if you will. You can do that through that link. And there's some other resources there that we're sharing. What I'd like to talk to you about is the beginnings of ranked choice voting in Utah. And you really have to go kind of all the way back to 1992. And if you remember in 1992, that's when Bill Clinton won, beat George H.W. Bush, who was running for his second term. And in that election, famously, Clinton wins with a plurality victory, which is actually how most American presidents have won in the last 30 years. But in that race in particular, a very conservative, outspoken, private sector entrepreneur reformer from Texas was running against him. That would have been Ross Perot. Now, what's interesting about Ross Perot is he lived in Harris County, Texas. I used to live there. That's Houston. And George H.W. Bush was actually the chairman of the Harris County Republican Party years and years ago. So no doubt Ross Perot and George H.W. Bush knew each other and perhaps didn't see eye to eye. But Ross Perot ran as an anti-establishment, outside, drain the swamp, fix Washington type of candidate. And unfortunately, in a lot of red states, he spoiled the election for George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton won because of this three-way dynamic and because of plurality. Well, in 1996, I lived in Kansas at the time, and my senator, Bob Dole, was running for U.S. president, and he likewise lost the election again due to plurality victories in these key states where had Ross Perot not been on the ballot, it is quite likely, especially depending on how Pennsylvania went, that Bob Dole would have beat Bill Clinton in 1996. So by the time the year 2000 rolls around, folks that are a little older and wiser than me, I was still in high school, but people like Nancy Lord and other conservative Republican activists in Utah were sick and tired of Republicans losing around the country. And they were thinking about, and in Utah, and in fact, we had Governor Matheson, we had Jim Matheson. We'll actually get to the Mathesons in a minute, but what happened was a couple of these conservative activists in Utah were looking at things like Robert's Rules of Order, which actually outlines the concept of ranked choice voting, preference voting, the idea that a body politic ought to use majority as the rule to decide who wins. And so one gentleman here in Utah, who's a very outspoken advocate for a variety of constitutional and conservative causes, ranked choice voting was one of them, named Mike Ridgway, he actually calls into the Rush Limbaugh show in 1999 and says, Rush, Republicans are going to lose if Pat Buchanan runs as a Reform Party candidate. And actually, Pat Buchanan at that time was a strong contender for the presidential nomination of the Republican Party, but was toying with the idea of running as a third-party candidate. And so in that conversation, he was outlining this idea from Robert's Rules of Order that we ought to have some sort of a ranked style ballot, that we could figure out how to stop the spoiler effect. And so that was the beginning of ranked choice voting in Utah, was that he and others joined with him, including Lowell Nelson right here in Utah County, one of our probably preeminent scholars in our county on Robert's Rules of Order and other parliamentary procedures and ranked choice voting specifically. Along with Nancy Lord and others, they actually advocated that the Utah Republican Party use ranked choice voting in its conventions to speed up the multiple round process that was often used, where you see a big drop off in participation. And so in the early days, in about the year 2000, there were some special conventions where they used it. And then in 2004, during the state convention, that was the first year I was a state delegate, we had like 9 candidates running for governor to replace outgoing Governor Leavitt, who had left Eileen Walker to kind of occupy the seat, but he had gone to Washington, appointed by President Bush. And so you had this big race, open seat, if you will, for governor, in which ultimately John Huntsman Jr. and Nolan Karras were the 2 winners, and they went on to the primary election. But what was great about that election was that all the delegates essentially participated in all the rounds of the election and were able to coalesce behind the 2 leading contenders that would ultimately go to that primary. And when I participated in that election, I was like, this is a really nifty system, super efficient, really easy to understand. As I thought about all 9 of these candidates, I'm thinking, well, I like some better than others, and I kind of like this one more than that one. And so having that ranked choice ballot allows you to express that preference, which if you're a delegate, you're familiar with that process. Even if you do it in multiple rounds, in a way that's still kind of like ranking. It's just hard to do that for all voters across the entire community in one government-run election. It might be easier when you're here in an auditorium as delegates and you line up and drop off ballots over and over and over again. But it's still ranking the candidates in a sense, right? So ranked choice voting allows us to do that in a bigger ballot. Well, that same year, in 2004, there were 3 candidates running for the National Committee woman spot. One of them was Nancy Lord, and she actually won, and they used ranked choice voting. And that's kind of the beginnings of it. And then it began to be used in the party off and on. Oftentimes we use it in our caucus meetings. And then, of course, fast forward a few years, and we've got SB 54, which allows candidates to essentially go around the convention process, lining up the possibility for a 3, 4, 5-way Republican primary on the ballot, creating a very real plurality problem when it comes to Republicans nominating their banner carrier for the general election. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy to share a few thoughts, and then Mark to talk a little bit more about the genesis of kind of why we're here and how this came to Utah.
Well, when we talked to delegates after the 2004 state convention, so many of them said, wow, that was really an awesome way to vote. They loved it because they were able to weigh in on the race as it throughout the whole thing. See, one of the downsides of multiple rounds of voting in a convention or something like that, where you have that opportunity, which you don't have in a primary or a general election, is that it takes a lot more time to do a multiple round of voting. And each time you do that, I mean, we've watched this for 20, 25 years. Every time you go to the next round, there's somewhat of a drop-off. It depends on the importance of the race to those who are voting. But people have to go home. They get fatigued. They have responsibilities. And so they leave. And so by the time you get to the last round of voting in a multiple round race, you don't even have a majority of the people who were there in the first place deciding. So with ranked choice voting, or instant runoff voting is another name for it, preferential voting is also another name for it, it's like condensing a multiple round vote into one round of balloting with multiple rounds of counting those ballots. And so it saves a lot of time, and it enables you, if you like a candidate that probably isn't going to end up winning, but you really like them and you really want to give them your vote, you don't have to vote strategically under ranked choice voting. You can vote for who you really want. We call that sincere voting. You can vote for who you really want, and you don't have to vote for any candidates that you would not want to have your vote count for. And if your first choice gets eliminated on the first round of counting, and since most of you have experienced it, I'm not going to explain that, but if you want to ask questions about that later, we'll be happy to explain it. If your candidate gets eliminated, you get a chance to still weigh in on the final or on the continuing head-to-head races among all the candidates. So it eliminates the vote splitting factor. For example, if you had one moderate and two conservatives in a race, and whether it's convention or the primary or whatever, the two conservatives are splitting the conservative vote. So the moderate is more likely to win because the conservative vote is split among two candidates. And so, say 60% of the people want one of the conservatives, but they're split between the two, and only 40%, or let's use the number that was given earlier, 37%, want the moderate. The moderate ends up winning because the conservatives split each other's vote. I don't know about you, but there's another criterion in election integrity or election science, if you will, that is called the majority criterion. And to me, that is one of the most important criterion that we have in deciding what kind of election system we have. The voice of the people should be decided by a majority, not a plurality. That, to me, that is so fundamental. I have a very strong belief that it is not common that the will of the people will choose something bad. But how do we determine what the will of the people is unless we can do it by a majority? Otherwise, we don't know. And then you don't get loser buy-in to the results because the losers know that the majority of the people didn't support that winning candidate. That happened in the gubernatorial primary here in Utah a couple of years ago. We say we like Robert's rules. And we use Robert's rules as our rules in the Republican Party. Well, in Robert's rules, it says that a rule that a plurality shall elect is unlikely to be in the best interest of the average organization. A better method in such cases is to prescribe some form of preferential voting. So I'll pass it on and let this guy say something.
I was just going to continue a little bit of Josh's history here of ranked choice voting in Utah. And we just feel like this is important to understand because as I go around, especially as the one who ran the bill, we hear over and over and over how this is brought to Utah by big money interests, outside influence, when in fact it couldn't be further from the truth. I got involved in the party about 2008-ish, graduated from BYU, moved out to San Quentin. And one of my neighbors was in this group with Nancy and Nelson and a few others that were very active in the party, promoting ranked choice voting. They got me.
We call it instant runoff voting. It's another name for it, ranked choice voting. And I loved it because I've always hated being in the position of I got to choose between the worst of two evils and be in this situation because I know if I vote here, it's going to split the vote. I'm going to end up with someone I don't want. So I love it. Fast forward to 2012, we redistrict. I'm sitting there in San Quentin, brand new district, no incumbent. And this neighbor is telling me I should run. Some city legislators are telling me I should run. I told them they're crazy. Next thing I know, I run, I win, and trying to figure out, okay, what do I do now? The youngest member of the legislature, I didn't really have a thing other than I always had like, hey, maybe I'll do this ranked choice voting thing because our elections are currently this plurality style. Maybe I'll introduce ranked choice voting at some point during my legislative career, whatever that looks like. 2013 is my first session. 2014, we get SB 54. That was a lot of fun. I was one of a few people in the House who ended up voting against it. SB 54 still passes. And one of the things they told us in the legislature is, hey, this is going to create a problem in the primaries because we're going to have this plurality issue in the primaries. Don't worry, we'll come back and fix it. So we go through that summer, that legislative session. In the summer, I'm looking around, nobody's proposing anything to fix it. There's no proposal to fix it. We're going to have this plurality situation in the primaries. And so I filed the first ranked choice voting bill that year. And it's just me. I'm filing this bill. I don't know if anybody else likes it or not, really, other than my neighbor, Nancy, Lowell, Mike Ridgway, a few people. I file it. The county clerks kind of freak out about it. They tell me it's going to cost $15 million, huge fiscal note. We did have different machines then, so I changed the bill to propose a different method to handle the plurality situation with SB 54. Passed out of the House, got killed in the Senate, and then after that I started working with the elections office. All right, okay, we got to get different equipment. Started working with the clerks. The clerk says, hey, this is going to be confusing. We can't do it. Well, over a few years, we got new election equipment. All the election equipment natively supports ranked choice voting. It works right within the election equipment. Ran another bill, didn't get anywhere fighting with the clerks because the clerks are telling me this is confusing, it's going to be hard for people, they can't figure it out. It disenfranchises people, everything we've heard from here. And just fighting back and forth on this. Rebecca Chavez-Houck, a Democrat, I see one year she files the bill, so I let her run it that year, and I co-sponsor it. It flies through the House. And this would have put ranked choice voting at every level. Primaries, general election, majority in the House, super majority in the House passes it. Run out of time, kind of gets stuck in the Senate, it doesn't pass. The clerks got really nervous that year about it, showed up in the Senate really hard, trying to kill it, doesn't pass. So that summer I negotiate with the clerks and say, hey, you guys say it's confusing. We don't think it's confusing. You guys think it's going to be hard to count. We don't think it's hard to count. Let's just do a pilot. Let's test this thing out. And the clerk said, okay, let's test it out. So we run a bill that is what we have today. It's a pilot project for cities to opt in, if they want to, ranked choice voting. And again, this is just me at this point. There's no outside influence. There's no George Soros. There's no Bill Gates. And I'll tell you, I've received emails and letters from election integrity groups saying, hey, HB 35 Municipal Alternative Voting Pilot Project brought to Utah by outside influence and big money George Soros. And I'm reading this letter that I get emailed to me thinking, wow, where's my Lamborghini? I haven't spoken to George Soros yet. You know, where's the big money interests? And so finally that last year, partner with Rebecca Chavez-Houck again, we do this pilot project, and the clerk said, okay, we'll back off, we won't do anything, and we get the bill passed. Legislature passes it, overwhelmingly. And then it was our duty to go out now and explain to everybody in the cities how it worked. Well, I'd always been passionate about ranked choice voting. If we go back and look at 2010 with Mia Love, you know, this is a threat to conservatives in Utah, and it has been, especially in CD4. Mia Love lost by about 700-ish votes to Matheson. I think it's 2010, right? The Libertarian candidate that year got around 2,000, 2,100 votes, right? It's likely if we have ranked choice voting, those libertarian voters will express their first choice in the first round of voting for their libertarian candidate. But if that libertarian candidate doesn't make it through the first round, they're going to show up and most likely vote for Mia Love in the second round. We didn't have ranked choice voting, we ended up with Jim Matheson. And that's how ranked choice voting works. It's multiple rounds. In a perfect world, we would all show up. In a perfect world, we would all sit here, we would all be educated on the candidate first, all the candidates, right? We would vote, and if nobody gets 50%, we would drop off the bottom vote getters, and we would all sit here, nobody would go home, and we would do it again. And we would repeat this process until somebody gets 50% or more. That's what ranked choice voting does, and it does it on one ballot at once. So as a voter, I feel more confident, I don't feel disenfranchised. After the primary election, governor's election this last time around, I was talking to my neighbors across the street. I was in the legislature at the time, they always asked me, who do I vote for, what should I do? And I'm like, well, what do you think? Who are you going to vote for? And he's like, well, you know, I really like Greg Hughes. I really like Greg Hughes, but I can't stand Huntsman. You know, this is words from my neighbor. I'm like, so what are you going to do? Well, I got to vote for Cox. But I really like Greg Hughes. But if I vote for Greg Hughes, he was worried in his mind that it's going to be a vote for pull votes away from Cox, and Huntsman's going to get elected. So he plugged his nose and voted for Spencer Cox. And I sat down there and I explained to him, well, what if you could do it like this? What if you could rank your first choice? And if you don't get them, and nobody gets first 50% after the first round, then you go to your second choice. You're voting again. Everybody's voting. It's another round of voting. He loved it. It was super intuitive to him. In 2020, what was the first year we did it in the cities? 2019 was the first year we did it in the cities. We had 2 cities do it, Payson and Vineyard. The clerk said nobody's going to understand it, nobody's going to get it, it's going to be hard to count, it's going to be a failure. It was easy to count. Results were posted that night, and the polling of those who participated in that election, the people loved it. And Payson and Vineyard have done it every year since. The following election cycle, we had over 20 cities in Utah do it. Did polling again. It was counted, easily counted. Results posted that night. People loved it. They liked it. They wanted to do it again. It's not hard. It's intuitive. People understand it. We did I think Josh did the test at a senior living center. Didn't explain to him how it works. Just said, hey, here's all the national parks, right? Here's all the national parks, rank them. We're going to see which national park we prefer. Didn't explain to him. Pulled it off flawlessly. Didn't even have to explain it to him. So that's the history of ranked choice voting in Utah, how it came to Utah. No outside interest. Now, are there groups, national groups, who support it? Yes, there are. They've been there, they're out there, and they are now supporting it in Utah, as are other national groups who are opposing it, who are here today opposing it in Utah. So yes, there's national groups, and there shouldn't be anything wrong necessarily with that. But I'm going to wrap there and just let Josh close our 25 minutes.
Majority matters, and it matters because the outcomes of elections matter. And if you look at it from a Republican perspective, you've had 3 U.S. Senate races that were winnable last year. You've got Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania, Blake Masters in Arizona, and Don Moldick in New Hampshire. All 3 of them were in states that Republicans could possibly win, but they had to go through bruising primaries. And ultimately, they did not win. If you look at the Oz race, Dr. Oz had millions of dollars spent against him in the primary. With ranked choice voting, if we were to use this in Republican primaries, we would be able to put forward more consensus nominees that I think have better shots at winning, and through a process and a method by which we don't beat ourselves up and put ourselves at a disadvantage when it comes to the general election. If you were to use ranked choice voting in general elections, there's a good shot that due to this spoiler effect with third parties, Republicans would have won 12 U.S. Senate races over the last 20-25 years, which many of those Senate races ultimately made the difference in Democrats getting a 60-vote majority in the Senate, which made them filibuster-proof so that they could pass Obamacare. When the Senate gets to 60 votes for one party or the other, especially if you have party control of 3 branches, all the policy options are on the table for those parties. And in the case of Obama and his administration, having those 60 Democrat votes in the Senate was key to getting his agenda passed. I would submit to you that those senators would not have gotten that 60 majority in the Senate had we had ranked choice voting. You know, you look at like in 2006 when the incumbent Republican senator was beat by less than 1%, and the Libertarian got nearly 6% in that election. If you look just in 2020 in Georgia, the Purdue race, Purdue came in first place in the first general election, and then they had the runoff, and then he lost.
About like 49.8.
Yep, 49.7. So I would submit to you that we would be far better off if we valued a majority victory in our elections. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll just defer to Wendy here and let her figure out how to get this up.
It's in the email.
Oh, it's in the email? One of these slides. This one I might even know how to get it to go full screen.
What? It's not on. There we go. All right. Ranked choice voting. Mathematically flawed, unnecessarily complicated. There's so many things. Like I said, I usually do an hour-and-a-half presentation on this. So if you have questions, let me know, and we can talk fast another time. I'm going to address the complexity issue. A few years ago, I heard this phrase, complexity favors the well-connected, and I think that's an important thing to think about. The more complicated things are, it seems like that tends to favor people who can navigate the system. This is a mock-up of a Weber County ballot if the 2016 election had been held using ranked choice voting. So that's just to give you a flavor for what we're dealing with here. What's interesting about ranked choice voting is you can talk to people who experienced it and they liked it and they said, oh, emotionally there's a lot to like about ranked choice voting. Let me say, the idea of voting for, not having to vote for the lesser of two evils sounds very appealing. I've run for election twice and I voted for myself both times, and I was the lesser of two evils because not a single perfect person has ever run for public office in the history of the world. And I'm willing to state that as a fair statement. When you talk to people about it, they will say that it might be easier, they may have liked it, but when you look at the actual ballots and you see how many of them were discarded, that will tell you a completely different perspective. So in the 2021 elections, there were 17 ranked choice voting races that Utah County conducted. One of those was two of them were in Moab. And of those, 7 of the 17 races had 10% or more discarded or confused ballots. And those are ballots where the voter did not fill it out correctly. Okay, that's important. What that means, if they were discarded, they either didn't rank anybody at first position or they ranked 2 or more people at first position. If they were confused, they didn't rank somebody at one of the subsequent positions. And this is different than exhausted ballots, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this is voter error on the ballots. In general, my understanding is that we have on average 1% of confused ballots that are discarded in an average traditional election. I want you to look at Genola City Council. In their seat 1 race, 58.1% of the ballots were discarded or confused. So when you talk about a majority, it's a majority of the ballots that were actually counted, not of those 58%. And because you use the same ballots for seat 2, if you were confused with seat 1, it just exacerbates that problem, and it's 74.7% for seat 2. So I would submit that even though people may be polled and say it was easy, the reality of the ballot shows otherwise. Promises. There are a lot of things that ranked choice voting promises, but there are a lot of areas where they fail. First of all, it creates the illusion of a majority. It does not guarantee a majority except in the final round of counting. It's not out of all of the ballots cast. The consensus winner does not always win. Bullet voting in multi-seat city council races. What I mean by bullet voting is you have 3 city council seats, and instead of voting for 3 people, you vote for 1, and you might get a group of people to get 1 person in by that bullet voting. In ranked choice voting, the way that we do it, the bullet voting is not chosen by the voter who says, I'm only going to vote for 1 candidate. It's chosen by the algorithm. It neuters fringe or third-party influence because it consolidates candidates into two groups. So what we've heard explained is correct. It does consolidate, it does avoid the spoiler effect, but if you're a third-party or fringe candidate, you might be able to have an influence on the more major party candidate because there might be a threat of splitting the vote, and you might get some concessions about, oh, well, we are kind of similar on these things. Third parties will not win under ranked choice voting unless and until they become a majority party. Fifth choice votes can overcome first choice votes, and the most important thing in my opinion is it centralizes the tabulation. So I'm going to go through these really fast, and just remember I'm a math geek, and so if you don't understand it, that's okay. In the Sandy Mayors race, how many of you, by show of hands, remember there was something weird about the Sandy Mayors race, right? And I've heard people say, well, all of these other races went well, but if it fails at the extremes, then it fails. In the Sandy Mayors race, this is an example of the illusion of the majority. And so I go back to, would you rather have the illusion that Governor Cox won with 50% or the reality that you won with 37% or whatever it was? The two candidates were separated by a 21 vote difference in the final round of counting. According to ranked choice voting, the winner won with 50% of the vote, but there were 4,000 exhausted ballots. What that means is there were over 4,000 people who chose not to rank either of those two final candidates. So again, it's not a majority. 18.9% of the ballots were exhausted in that race, yielding a 40.6% win for the eventual winner. In Moab 2021, the seat 1 race, the consensus winner was not elected. The winner was a man by the name of Jason, but if you take their rankings and you compare them head to head, every single one of the candidates head to head, Luke, and I'm not going to pronounce his name, Luke W, it's written up there, he won head to head with every single other candidate in that analysis of the ballots. So the consensus winner is not always the one who is elected. Lehigh City Council, this is an example of bullet voting. Those of you in Lehigh, if you voted for Michelle Miles, there were 1,376 voters who ranked her first. She comes in second for seat 1. So those people only ever got that vote for Michelle Miles counted by the algorithm. They filled out the ballots like everybody else. They didn't choose to only vote for her. So second seat, everything gets reset. And the people that voted for Michelle Miles are still voting for Michelle Miles. They go through all the rounds in seat 2 and they still voted for Michelle Miles. In the Payson and Vineyard elections in 2019, that rate of people who only got one choice for 3 seats or 2 seats was 25% in each. In the Oakland mayor's race, this is a really interesting one. This was 2010. If you notice the second row, Don Parada, he starts out in the first round with 21,000 vote lead, and it takes 9 additional rounds for the second place winner to eventually amass second and third and so on choice votes to overcome his 21,000 vote lead and win with 2,000 votes. But if you look on the lower right, there were 13,000 people who didn't vote for either one of those two candidates in the final round of counting. So that is not a majority win. Centralization of counting. You cannot add the results of Davis to Salt Lake to Utah County and come up with a winner like we do in traditional elections. That's because the order in which a candidate is eliminated determines the trajectory of who wins the election. The best analogy I've come up with, forgive my math brain, is order of elimination. If you add first before you multiply, you get a different result than if you multiply first. And that's how you need to think about centralized counting. If we were to do ranked choice voting, we would never be able to count the election results in the precinct. Currently, if we were to do a gubernatorial race, the lieutenant governor's office would be responsible for tabulating all of those ballots. I'll leave you with my favorite Thomas Jefferson quote, "What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every government which has ever existed under the sun? The generalizing and concentrating all cares and power into one body." On that concept alone, we should oppose ranked choice voting because it centralizes power and takes it away from the local people. The concept of political equality from the Declaration to the Gettysburg Address can mean only one thing, and I have to add here, Lincoln was elected by a plurality. One person, one vote. Our traditional one person, one vote system is something that everybody can understand and that everybody appreciates. It is simple, it is fair, and it is transparent. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for hanging in with us through this debate tonight. This has been fantastic. Well, I'm going to pick up where my partner left off by talking about some of the problems that jurisdictions across the country have experienced when they use ranked choice voting. And I think that the best place to start is the most recent state to adopt ranked choice voting, Alaska. This is a graphic that was put together by the Washington Post to show us what happened in the first RCV election that Alaska used. This was the special congressional election that for the first time in the state's in 50 years sent a Democrat to Congress to represent Alaska. You can see the distribution of votes at the top. This represents how things broke down in the first round of voting. So Mary Peltola got a plurality, 40%, and then the Republicans split the vote. So almost 60% of Alaskans voted for a Republican. They split the vote. We heard a lot about how ranked choice voting prevents spoilers. In this context, ranked choice voting actually allowed a spoiler effect to take place. And the reason it did was because it denied the ability of Alaska Republicans to hold a primary. It denied the ability of Alaska Republicans to rally around a single candidate, so you wound up with Nick Begich and Sarah Palin duking it out and dividing each other's votes. But it's not just that that's a problem that you see here. This also shows us exactly what you just heard, that this majority that we talk about so much is actually just a mirage. You see, since no one got over 50% of the vote, you had to proceed through the elimination rounds. Nick Begich gets eliminated, his ballots get redistributed, and Mary Peltola claims a 51.5% majority. But you only can claim that majority because of what you see in the middle column. That white column in the middle represents 11,000 people who voted for Nick Begich and no one else. When he was eliminated, their votes were eliminated as well. This is called ballot exhaustion. And it's not just that those ballots are eliminated from the numerator of the voting equation, that is, the votes cast for a particular candidate, they are removed from the denominator as well. So in a ranked choice election, each time you do a round of elimination, it is as though fewer and fewer people voted. That is the only way that you can guarantee that ranked choice voting gives you a majority. It's just a manufactured mathematical illusion. Let's also talk briefly about Oakland. We saw a slide about an Oakland mayoral race from 13 years ago, 9 rounds of elimination, and the person who came in first wound up losing after you tallied second and third place votes. But let's talk about a more recent Oakland election. This was November of last year. There were a series of issues that actually led to some fairly significant problems in Oakland. Oakland, as we know, uses RCV for local races. What happened, though, was that hundreds of voters did not list a candidate in the first place slot. Now, the law says that those ballots were supposed to be counted anyway, but they weren't, and no one picked up on that problem for months. In the end, the results were certified, and in a school board race, the wrong person was declared the winner. It took 4 months and a lawsuit to decide that the person that the people had actually elected should actually be seated. These are problems that ranked choice voting exacerbates. And you need to think about this. The problems are first that the RCV ballot is so complicated that a lot of people looked at it and didn't realize that they were supposed to rank someone first. And then the process of tabulating is so confusing that when the mistake was made and ballots were improperly thrown out, it was months before anyone identified that problem. These are real issues with ranked choice voting. And now let's talk about one of the most recent jurisdictions that flirted with RCV, Arlington County, Virginia, just north of where I happen to live. This is the first jurisdiction in the Commonwealth of Virginia to use RCV for a public election. It was for a Democratic primary to fill 2 open county board seats. There were 6 people that were running. Voters were allowed to rank 3 of them to fill 2 seats in a single election. Ranked choice voting, friendly and approachable.
The end result was so complicated that many of the people who were actually running the election couldn't explain the results, and voters were incredibly confused about who their votes actually were counted for. And you can see the results here on the screen. I apologize that the numbers are a little bit small, but I want to flag a few issues because they're quite elucidating, and Arlington County sort of shows us what we could expect to see in more complicated ranked choice elections. So first of all, let's look at the fact that the person here who I have outlined in red, Susan Cunningham, got the most votes in the first round. Now, in any plurality system, that would guarantee her a win. With ranked choice voting, though, it took 6 rounds of elimination to decide that the person who got the most votes should actually be a winner in the election. But take a look at what it did to her apparent margin. This gets to the point that we just mentioned earlier, that what you're getting with the ranked choice voting system isn't really a majority, it's a mirage, it's manufactured, and it's inflated. 25% of voters voted for Susan Cunningham in the first round. She was leading Natalie Roy, who got the second most votes by only a couple of hundred ballots. And yet by the end of this process, Susan Cunningham could say that she won 60% of the vote. 25 to 60. 60% is a mandate. Can you really say that when only a couple of hundred more people voted for her in the first round? I'm not sure. And let's also look at what happened to the second place person. Again, the person in a plurality election for a multi-member district, 2 seats to fill, she would have been the person who filled the second seat. But by the end of the process, ranked choice had eliminated her and elevated the third place candidate to the other slot. And by the way, elevated her margin from 23 to 40%. Now, we've heard that ranked choice voting is the way to glean majorities and to find consensus. But one of the interesting dynamics at play in the Arlington election was that the issue that was dividing these top 3 candidates was an incredibly local issue, right? But I hope you'll bear with me because it's helpful to explain. Arlington County is trying to get rid of single-family zoning, right? The 2 candidates who got the most votes, first and second place in the first round, campaigned against eliminating single-family homes. The third place candidate campaigned in favor of the county's push to get rid of single-family zoning. Taken together, the first and second place people almost get 50% of the vote in their own right. But ranked choice voting didn't deliver 2 people who had that opinion. It delivered one who had an opinion favoring the change and one who did not. And when the Washington Post wrote an article reporting that, unsurprisingly, Arlington County decided that its experiment was a failure and it wasn't going to use ranked choice in the general election after all, Representatives for Fair Vote, one of the national groups pushing ranked choice voting, said that this is actually a good idea to embrace ranked choice voting because it delivers inclusive, proportional results. And that's better than allowing narrow majorities to win elections and govern accordingly. So now we've gone from ranked choice voting delivers majorities to ranked choice voting suppresses majorities in favor of proportional representation. I think that's very concerning. Now let's talk briefly about how this pushes politics to the left. You know, we heard a lot just a moment ago, and I don't doubt it for a second, that the idea to bring ranked choice voting to Utah was a pure and good one, and I don't doubt that. But I think that we have to recognize not just the genesis of an idea, but who is using the idea now and what purposes they are putting it to. In fact, we've already heard that while the idea may have come from within the state, outside groups, including left-wing groups, are coming in supporting this, and they are pushing it nationwide. And that's why I think it's important to ask that old question, we don't know who benefits, and the most important thing to do there is to follow the money. Now, nationally, we're looking at tens of millions of dollars flowing into the push for ranked choice voting, and it's coming from Open Society. That's George Soros' operation. It's coming from the Arnold Foundation, a left-wing philanthropic enterprise led by a Texas billionaire named John Arnold. It's coming from the Tides Foundation, a pillar of left-wing nonprofit philanthropy for decades. And it's coming from Catherine Gell, a billionaire, a former Obama bundler, who has decided that the right thing to do is not just to use ranked choice voting, but to blow up party primaries. She calls this Final Five, and this is the system that is being pushed all over the country. And they finance groups, including Fair Vote and others, and they have organizations like Unite America that direct funding to in-state organizations to push ranked choice voting. And they deploy millions upon millions of dollars to bring ranked choice voting, particularly to red states, which is quite interesting, but also to blue states, and I'll turn to that in a second. Look at the figure at the bottom though, Missouri. Almost $7 million last year went into Missouri to bring ranked choice voting, just to gather signatures. Now they didn't gather enough and the measure didn't ultimately get put on the ballot, but 99% of the money on a Missouri ballot measure campaign came from a group called Article 4 in Virginia, which was financed by a Texas billionaire named John Arnold. Out-of-state money is very much coming into states to change their election systems, and I think it's quite reasonable to ask why a group of elite left-wing donors would be buying a new election system across the country. And as I said, they have developed an army of organizations that they are financing and supporting in various ways all across the country to give the appearance that this is a homegrown effort now. I don't care where it was 10, 15 years ago, but right now, as we look at ballot measures in Idaho, in Arizona, in Nevada, in Oregon, in Ohio, the push is coming from this network which is working together to push ranked choice voting. But again, I want to make sure that I'm stressing this point. It's not just about bringing ranked choice voting to elections. And we've heard a lot about how ranked choice voting can be used in primaries in this debate today. But increasingly, the advocates for ranked choice are saying, we actually need to get rid of partisan primaries. Right? This is an organization, R Street, it's a DC-based think tank, that is going around saying that the idea here is to disrupt the parties, to weaken the political parties. It's not about using ranked choice in a Republican primary or a Democratic primary. It's about having all Republicans and all Democrats and all Greens and all Socialists run in a jumbo primary together, and then the top vote getters go to the general election, and then you rank the candidates and compute the results. And this is so important as far as priorities go, that a group in Arizona that until recently was pushing ranked choice voting has decided they're not going to push ranked choice voting directly anymore. They're instead going to turn to a ballot measure to create what they term open primaries. But it's really just this California-style jumbo primary system with an option to bring ranked choice voting if it passes. So let's return to my original question. What do these billionaires and special interest groups get with all the money that they're pouring into this cause? Well, they get an entirely new election system. A new election system that is dominated by different dynamics at the primary and in the general election. First of all, you get rid of the party primaries, you weaken the political parties themselves, and you create a power vacuum. A power vacuum that can be filled by the operation that the left has built. How many folks in this room have heard of Arabella Advisors? Okay, we see a few people down here. Arabella Advisors is an organization that manages a series of nonprofit funds that bring in billions of dollars every year to finance the left's entire operation. They're C3s and C4s. This is one of the largest dark money networks, and it is funded by exactly the same people that are pushing ranked choice voting right now. They are looking for a way to increase their clout and influence in our political system, and weakening the parties is one of the best ways to do it. But bringing ranked choice to the general election is another. Why is that? Because, I hate to say this, and I apologize to any politicians in the room, I say present company accepted. Politicians will politician. They want to win elections. And whether you like it or not, negative campaigns work. Now, in a ranked choice election, you have an incentive to be, as we've heard previously, civil. I would say inoffensive would be perhaps a better way to do it, so that you can get those second and third place votes. But you still need someone to do the dirty work. And so what you see is candidates shifting negative campaigns even more to dark money and groups like that can do independent expenditures. In fact, there was an MIT study that showed exactly this happening in Maine when they used ranked choice voting, a sharp spike in negative independent expenditures in their campaigns. So you think you're getting cleaner, more civil elections. All you're actually getting is a campaign system which is just as negative or more so, and even more dependent on dark money. And guess where that dark money is coming from? The very same people that are paying for these ballot measures, that are paying for these lobbyists, that are pushing legislation all across the country to quite literally buy a new election system. Now, as I said before, have many policy reasons why I oppose ranked choice voting. But I can also tell you this, I do not believe that under the guise of a more democratic or representative system, we should let elites buy their way into more influence than ever before. And as I asked at the beginning, what interest does George Soros have in buying an election system that helps his rivals who he is working day and night to get rid of all across the country? So I think that we will have some time now for Q&A, and I do appreciate your time and for being here tonight to hear about ranked choice voting. Thank you.
All right, if we can give a hand to both panels. So next on our agenda is Q&A. It just says 20 minutes, so I am going to make an executive decision. It does say 1 minute for you to give your question, so if you're going to give a question that requires setup, think about what the minimum amount of information is for us to understand what you're asking. And we will give the panels 2 minutes to respond to each question. And that way, hopefully we get a few interesting questions. I don't know where the microphone is for the questions.
Maybe 3 minutes?
3 minutes?
There's not a lot of time to answer a question, but...
each panel has one, so we can...
You do 2 minutes? Better answer than
Let's ask the panel. Do you feel like 2 minutes is enough, or do you want 3 minutes per question? 2's fine. 2? Okay. So while we're figuring out where the microphone is, I just want to explain how voting works at my house and why that doesn't work. Oh, that's true. I could just pull this one off and pass it around. I call it dad choice voting. And the way it works is my kids come and ask me a question. The first vote that I give them is, what did mom say? And then if mom didn't say anything, then the next choice is it going to cost me anything? Am I going to be liable for what you do? And then does it involve anything that I have to do? And if it does, then how far do I have to drive, right? And then finally, no. So that's how it works at my house. But yeah, we'll just go ahead and pass this microphone around.
Sounds like preferential voting at your house.
Yes, my preference. Somebody said that sounds like preferential voting at my house, and it's my preference unless my wife has one. All right. Who has a question? We'll do it then. Yeah, let's form a line over here. We'll just start with.
Okay, so my descriptions of ranked choice voting, I say that here in Utah County we're very conservative, and if you rank like 5 candidates, you're going to see most conservative to least conservative. And the person that's going to drop out in the first round is going to be the least conservative. And those votes are going to roll up. It's a roll-up process in ranked choice voting. And there's a lot of money that's being spent to convince Utah that ranked choice voting is good. Well, the Washington, D.C. Democrat Party, they just released a study on ranked choice voting. It's a PowerPoint presentation. And they are opposed to ranked choice voting because it's just the opposite. You're going to have the most liberal on the top and the most conservative on the bottom, and those conservative votes are going to roll up, and hopefully the thought is there might be a second strong candidate that would beat all those roll-up votes and get that vote and take it away from the most liberal. So it works either way. So what's your response to DC not having a lot of ranked choice voting funds to convince them to keep ranked choice voting, as opposed to Hebert have a lot of money to convince us to take ranked choice voting?
Well, so I think that what you're seeing in Washington, D.C. right now with the lawsuit is pretty interesting from this debate's perspective. And I think it goes to both what you were talking about concerns about what sort of candidates you'll get, not necessarily being the most liberal candidates. I mean, Washington, D.C., just to give you some perspective, enfranchised non-citizen voting, including illegal alien voting in the nation's capital. And the Washington Post called them out for that because, according to the Post, this is not me, according to the Post, what the D.C. City Council was doing was trying to build a new electorate that was more progressive to match
the city council and the politicians that are in elected office right now to match their very progressive views rather than them moderating in order to match the electorate. But I also think that one of the dynamics that is driving this is the fact that this is a disruptive enterprise for the party. And that gets to the point that I was talking about before. This isn't about strengthening the party or finding better candidates that reflect what the party wants to put on the ballot. It's about weakening the party so that other interests can begin to take over and have more influence than they do previously. And that's why I think you see in states where Democrats are in control, party Democrats are often opposed to ranked choice voting, just like you see Republicans in other states. Again, whatever you say about the particulars of a party, I would much rather have that process than a bunch of left-wing billionaires controlling our election system and having more influence than they do right now. And I think that is part of the reason why you see such resistance in these deep blue areas to ranked choice voting, including in Washington, D.C.
All right, does the other panel want to respond?
Oh, sure. I mean, the scenario you're talking about are municipal elections, which typically are nonpartisan. So you're talking about a perception of an ideological position of a nonpartisan municipal officer. And in a scenario like that, where they're nonpartisan, and the way that our city council elections work here in Utah, is many candidates as want can run. And then in the traditional sense, the winner is the one who gets the most votes. So the easiest way to manipulate the current system would just be for these left-wing billionaires, which this happens, to recruit a candidate to dilute the votes of the person they don't want to win. And the reason that you have a ranked choice ballot is to eliminate that as an option so that people can vote their conscience and they don't have to worry about strategic voting and there's no vote splitting. And the people who win ultimately represent the majority of those who participated and those who are in the community, who that majority of that community, they deserve to be governed by themselves, by the representatives that they elect through the voice of the people. And this happens all the time in politics, where you just, whatever the rules are, you figure out how to win, and right now a common thing to do is to force plurality outcomes by recruiting candidates to run in a race to dilute the voters that would support your opponent who you're trying to beat. So, and this actually happened quite well in Illinois, not exactly in the general election, but speaking of left-wing billionaires, Governor J.B. Pritzker spent millions of dollars basically flaming the least electable Republican candidate so that that candidate would win the primary, which they did, and then they lost the general election. And if you talk to Republicans in Illinois, they're livid about it. They wish that one of the other Republican candidates could have gone to the general and had a better shot against Governor Pritzker. So I think that the whole point of ranked choice voting is to eliminate the kind of strategy that can happen and the kind of manipulation that happens in the political space.
And that's happened a lot in Utah over the years. I mean, we watched that with a couple of Senator Hatch races over the years. So don't think that hasn't happened in Utah too, and don't think that's not an incentive in plurality voting, because it is.
I think Mark has, or Matt's next.
We've got 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So
I'm just going to say.
Come join the line.
Great. So a few comments first. With the plurality system we have, we are burdening the people with calculating a potential outcome rather than allowing them to vote their conscience, in my opinion. You can probably tell I'm a preferential vote proponent. I definitely think that exhaustive ballots are totally a concern. I'd like to learn more about that. I think the exhaustive ballots, because of human error, should be the only cause for concern, though. The elimination algorithm is the critical issue, in my opinion, and hopefully we must mirror the multi-round approach. I don't agree with the gentleman, Mr. Steed's comment about inclusion. I think it was not fairly portrayed. I think ranked choice voting actually is much more inclusive because it allows those who are in the other rounds to express their opinion with the majority vote. And I think that's an important part to highlight, not to be a discriminatory issue. Okay, my question is how does ranked choice voting deal with a tie, and how does traditional voting deal with a tie?
Who wants to answer first?
I'll go first. I'll go through technical. So ties, generally speaking, rules and laws decide how ties are broken. A lot of state laws will say usually it's by a random method, casting lots, flipping a coin, etc. In the case of ranked choice voting, if there's a tie, you do the same thing, right? Now, there are rules you could set that would be different. You could set a rule that says, well, in the case of a ranked choice election, if in one of the rounds there's a tie, you could say the tie is broken by, maybe the total of first place votes of the two competitors in the tie. You do have more options in that sense, because with a ranked choice election, you have more information from the voters about their preferences. And so you can actually make more decisions about what would be most fair, most representative of the voice of the people. And then you talk about exhausted ballots, so I'll give a technical question or technical response to that. Exhausted ballots is the idea that a voter did not rank all the candidates, and so at some point in time, that ballot that voter submitted is exhausted. You can't count it for any other candidate because they didn't rank the other candidates, right? Well, this happens right now in plurality elections. If you have 4 candidates, and you can only vote for one, so anybody who voted for the other candidates, in a sense, they exhausted their ballots, particularly if you didn't vote for one of the top 2 candidates and you voted for one of the losing 2 candidates in a 4-way race, then all those ballots are exhausted under our existing plurality system. Another thing that happens is drop-off. When people don't participate in these later rounds, let's say you had an in-person election and people didn't stick around for round 5 and they left, right? That could be like an exhausted ballot. You see this head-to-head, Alaska and Georgia in 2022. In the Alaska Senate race, which was ranked choice voting, you can look at the actual exhausted ballots. Jason shared some of that. Those ballots, the exhausted ones, added up to 5% of the total ballots cast. When you look at Georgia, which had a 2-round election where people had to come back a month later, they actually had 10% drop off between those 2 rounds. So the ranked ballot gives you more ability to participate. Thanks.
All right, does the other panel respond?
I just want to point out, I don't have any problem with people exhausting their ballots. I don't want anybody to vote for anybody that they don't want. We just point that out because it's not a true majority.
And I want to make a couple of other points on this. So first of all, it's not just exhaustion that we have to be worried about in the sense that we've talked about. It's also errors, overvotes or undervotes, and particularly in a state like Utah where you vote by mail. Those errors can become fatal to your vote, right? Because once you get a mail-in ballot and you separate the ballot from its privacy sleeve, there is no way when you run it through the tabulation equipment to go back to the voter and say, hey, you made a mistake. So this is actually a problem, and given the complexity of RCV ballots, I think it's a problem that needs to be taken seriously. There's also not just the question of ballot exhaustion, but voter exhaustion. And by that I mean, it's not just one election, right? A lot of times we see, as a sample of how ranked choice voting works, rank your top 5 favorite ice cream flavors. But it's not like that in a real election. In a real election that uses RCV for all races, you're looking at 12 to 15 state and federal elections that could have 5 candidates each, and then you get into the local races as well. And there's one study that experimentally showed that you are adding about, in a final 5 type competition, a minute per race on top of the time it would already take a voter to fill out that ballot. So in just those first 12 to 15 rounds, you've added 12 to 15 minutes to the time it takes to vote. And you are also increasing the informational burden on voters who now have to figure out the platforms of 5 candidates in every race. That's going to be incredibly challenging. And I think by the time you get to those down ballot races, people are not going to be filling out those ballots with the ideal level of information or engagement, and you might actually see a lot fewer people participate. And that brings me to the last point that I want to make, which is that yes, you have more information, but more is not always better, right? What does a 3rd place vote actually mean? What does a 3rd place vote actually mean? I'm not sure that is a good vote for someone. Oh, sorry, I didn't say that.
Go ahead.
All right, I'm going to make another executive decision. Since you started the first question or answered the first question first, you answered the second. The one voter panel will answer this one first.
Mine is more math related, and so it kind of adjusts the limit of each panel. to kind of go over this, but when you think about the vote, and I understand the concept that we're trying to vote for someone, but in reality, we also have the privilege of voting against somebody at the same time, and that is the opposite of a flip of a coin. And so I'm trying to understand from a ranked choice voting perspective, as well as the non-ranked choice voting perspective. I understand it, and as kind of as he pointed out, how this goes up in tiers, it doesn't go down. And so the concept of me being able to not vote against somebody or make sure someone, if I had like a list of 6 people and I really didn't want the 6th person to be voted in, I didn't really care about the 5th, 4th, 3rd, either way it doesn't really matter. First and second guy, I kind of knew I wanted first and wanted second, but those next 3, the last person I knew for sure I didn't want him. That particular order that I needed to do, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, there was a possibility that the person at the bottom could be elected if I didn't order it in that correct order. Mathematically, statistically speaking, the possibility exists. So what is the difference, and are you allowed to vote against somebody with ranked choice voting?
Not really. That's actually the problem. One of the problems, in my opinion, is that in order to vote against someone and have it count as being voted against them, you have to be able to anticipate who the person that is most likely to be in the final round with them is, and give your support to that person. You can't cast a third party, I don't want to vote for either of them vote, and have it actually matter, because by the time you get to the end of all of the rounds, your ballot, if you didn't vote for everybody, will be eliminated. And so if there's somebody on there that you don't want to vote and don't want to have them happen, you have to be able to have a crystal ball to determine who the best candidate is to go up against them and support that one person.
All right, ranked choice.
Okay. In plurality, you're only voting for one, so your ballot gets thrown out. In essence, you're saying, I don't want any of those other 5, because you're not giving the option to say. But I think there's kind of an implicit assumption in your question, at least I'm reading this into it, that you kind of have to vote for every candidate.
No, it's just that I don't want someone. I
want
the perception of not voting against somebody, making sure somebody doesn't get it versus somebody getting it.
Okay. In plurality voting, there's no voting against somebody. You just simply don't vote for them. Agreed?
No. No, because you could, the other 3 options are available against it, because when you presented it in a way that was, if you take the bottom person out every single time and you go through, then you presented that as ranked choice voting. And I just presented a situation where my 3rd, 4th, and 5th actually matters in the way that it was presented in order for that to be right the first time, where I would actually maybe vote different for my 3rd, 4th, and 5th, depending on who was remaining in that drop the bottom last every single time going up. Does that make sense? So that way you can't go down, you can only go up, which statistically I can't vote against somebody.
Well, it kind of makes sense, but it kind of doesn't. Because see, you don't have to vote for anyone that you don't want to, so you can forget about all that strategic voting and only give your ranked choices to candidates that you would want to have your vote count for. And you never, as I said in the beginning, you should never be required to vote for any candidate that you would not want to get your vote. So that's, in essence, voting against any candidates that you don't absolutely want. You simply do not rank them anywhere on your ballot. And then you're choosing to potentially have your ballot exhausted if one of your choices that you ranked, if all of your choices that you ranked don't make it to the final 2, then your ballot becomes exhausted, but that happens all the time in plurality voting. If you choose to vote for a third-party candidate or whatever, your vote is exhausted. So it's not a right, it's a feature.
All right, next question.
Okay, my question is more policy-based. This is Republican County
Party. I know some of these questions we're talking about have to do with national elections or whatever, which I don't feel like we have much control over. But here within the Republican Party, I've been a delegate 30 years, been doing stuff, worked for Mike Levitt's campaign. I've been through a lot of these things where we go late nights and do a lot of these rounds of balloting. However, during my time, it seems like there's been a lot of movement towards people who are frustrated with people in the Republican Party, especially Democrats who like to infiltrate our party, come in, pretend to be Republicans, try and vote for really moderate candidates to push things in a way. And we seem to get things like SB 54, which is to undermine the caucus system, trying to get these things in here. My concern would be policy-wise, why don't we want the technology? Why don't we move towards where we talk about stuff as opposed to ranked choice voting where I have to do everything at once and wonder, almost like this guy said, maybe I want my fifth for life person to be third after I listen to the first round or whatever comes up. We talk about the ranked choice, but this is very complex. Why don't we have a way to have the voting go quicker? I've been in this auditorium multiple times. We vote quick, we go through the round, we get it done. Time's up. How come people don't do technology to just advance a more simple way as opposed to something complex? Why is that? The fact that we're here is too complex. Why is that?
Sorry, this is the ranked choice panels first.
I just want people to understand ranked choice voting really is not that complex. Once you have a few experiences with it, it's not. I mean, I've used it with junior high kids and they got it just like that. Josh used it with senior citizens, and they got it just like that. I think sometimes we overcomplicate it in our minds. It's simply addition and subtraction. It's not hard. It's ranking in your order of preference, and it doesn't require any more study than you should be doing anyway if you have 6 candidates, for example. You should be studying them all and saying, I don't want those guys, I do want these guys, but gosh, which one do I want the most? Having to rank them gives you more freedom, more option to continue in the counting process so that your voice is potentially heard, and you're still, at any one given point in time, only getting one vote for one voter.
Are we out of time or try? Oh, okay. Your question is like, why don't we make things simpler?
Counting faster. We always say it's simpler because it takes so long. These things are supposed to make it go faster. And I said, why not just make the counting process faster?
Well, I think what you're talking about is sort of digital systems, right?
Well,
I mean, if you did that little poll, when I share it, like shows you the results instantly. But there's definitely a suspicion about
count
technology.
ballots faster. You can count a paper ballot faster. It doesn't have to be on my phone or whatever. The last election, it was all jacked up. It didn't even put the ballots through at the state convention.
Well, I mean, I think to make things faster or simpler often requires technology, and there's certainly a resistance and suspicion of technology as part of the issue. If you're talking about voting in America faster and simpler, well, I mean, it kind of goes to maybe what Wendy was talking about, like, well, who do you want counting the votes? You want that to be really distributed or concentrated. And I would say the ranked choice voting won't concentrate anymore than in our current system, because it's really just export the data and share that. So Utah County we still count the ballots in Utah County, and then we send the results to the state, and then they add them up. So that's what I'd say. I mean, I agree 100% with your sentiment that we should be getting election results more quickly. I don't think that ranked choice voting is going to help with that. The results that I shared with you from the Arlington County board election were reported days after the rest of the state's results were in. Alaska, 2 weeks later, they were the slowest in the country, I believe, in reporting their results. There is a complexity process here, but it's also when you are running a ranked choice election, you also have to wait until all the votes are in, which means if you let mail ballots come in after election day, you have to wait until that period closes before you can do anything more than give the first place results, which can be radically different than the final outcome. So I agree with you 100%. And when you do polls, when you do focus groups, when you talk to voters, that's what they say is important, is having a simple system that delivers prompt and accurate results. And I think ranked choice voting actually makes that harder to do, and that works against the number one thing, which is building confidence in elections. There is resistance to technology and so forth, and I understand all of that. But making our system even more reliant on technology is not going to solve that problem. Turning it into a black box that sometimes even the people who operate it can't explain is not the solution. It will slow things down, and it will make trust in our election system worse than it already is.
So our 20 minutes for questions is over. We have 5, 6 people that want to ask questions. So what we're going to do is you have 10 seconds to ask your question. No setup, you just ask your question. Each panel has 1 minute to respond.
Okay, then I'm going to ignore what I was going to say to you guys. Ranked choice voting is not technically a simple concept when it comes to implementation. What safeguards or implementation measures would you adopt for ranked choice voting to address some of the issues as far as people being dropped off or, the second place candidate, dropping off for the third place candidate? I'm interested to see what safeguards against some of their concerns that you would do to make ranked choice voting effective.
One of the things that always reduces ballot errors if you're using some sort of a digital ballot marking device, but that can be controversial. But you can't rank 2 people first if the system says, no, you already picked first place, now you got to pick second place. You can't do 2 first places. So something like that, right? But at the end of the day, a lot of what they're talking about, undervotes, overvotes, it's just people not wanting to rank all the candidates, and you shouldn't have to rank all the candidates. The 10% that they quoted about the discarded ballots, that's ballots where people didn't rank everybody, but you don't have to rank everybody. So it is. It says undervotes or overvotes in the first round. When Yurgi did the study, he counted both of those as a discarded issue. So
Transparency is what prevents the black box.
right, you just share the data. It's really simple. We received 300 votes. Vote number 1 was an ABC. Vote number 2 was a BCA, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
It becomes a spreadsheet. It's really easy.
Do the one vote panel want to respond to that? All right.
So Jason had wrote some impressive slides up there of those who are favoring ranked choice voting. What he didn't say is that much of this has to do with additional reforms that have nothing to do with ranked choice voting. So Catherine Gale is the author of something called the Final Five, where you have a jungle primary and 5 people go to the general ballot. And none of us support that type of a concept. We're big believers in parties. We're big believers in a strong party. So the question is, who really is supporting ranked choice voting in the country? The 2 biggest donors are the Arnold Foundation, John Arnold, and United America, owned by the Murdoch family that owns Fox News. So we're getting so my question is it really, so billionaires fund things, they all have their own little things that they do. Is that the reason we should support or oppose ranked choice voting?
I would make a couple of points there. One is that John Arnold is one of the biggest liberal philanthropists in the country. If you don't believe me, go to influencewatch.com. You can look at the Arnold Foundation, the causes that they support. United America is owned by the Murdoch family, but it's not Rupert Murdoch. It's his daughter, who is also one of the nation's biggest liberal donors. So we need to be very careful about what we're saying here. There is far, far, far more money coming from the left to push ranked choice voting. And yes, they are embracing all over the place wherever they can, Final Five, blowing up the party primaries and ranking candidates in the general. But they also start with what they can get. So if they can get a party to embrace it for the primary, they will do that. If they can get a locality to do it, they will start small. And then before long, you will start seeing lobbyists going to your legislature, hey, we've been using this in the localities. Let's start doing it statewide. Let's start talking about Final Five. On the donor piece, the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros, if you go to his website, opensocietyfoundation.org, he's given over $20 billion in the last 30 years to causes all over the world, and he's really proud of it. He's proud of where he spends his money, and you can see where he spends his money. And I searched his website for an hour and could not find ranked choice voting, RCV, IRV, rank. Couldn't find any of those terms on his website. So he's much more interested in a lot of other causes. I don't think he cares a lick about ranked choice voting. I watched more hours of videos of him than I care.
but learned interesting things about him. But I would say there's money on all sides of the political spectrum.
Good time's up.
Thanks.
I'll try to be.
Oh, I turned it off. My bad.
I was an 18-year-old libertarian, conservative, Republican voter for Ross Perot. I don't like being in elections where I feel forced to choose between the lesser of two evils. And I don't like being in party politics when all of the people who believe like me have 10 or 15 candidates and there's one liberal and that guy wins. I hate that. The previous speaker, I can't think of anyone that I've disagreed with more. He's right about this. Isn't it possible, here's the question, isn't it possible that uber liberals and libertarian Republicans like myself can agree on ranked choice voting because it's simply the best system and most fair? And if it tends to favor one side or the other, it's just because that side is winning the ideological debate in society?
Question.
And then the follow-up.
That's it. Yeah, that's my question.
I don't even know where we're at.
Yeah, you're first.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that people could come together, and that's one of the things that sounds really good about it. But the reality is your libertarian vote is not going to count because whoever you're most closely aligned with, it's going to sweep them in there. You will not be able to make a protest vote. You will not be able to stand up and say the libertarians are right on this issue because they're going to be swept along with whichever of the Democrats and the Republicans you were closest to. I believe it was in Maine, they adopted ranked choice voting when the Green Party candidate kept splitting the vote. The reality is that if I'm George Soros or whomever, and by the way, it's unfair, but it's like where George Soros is listed. If I'm George Soros or the Koch brothers or whomever, I can fund 15 candidates for an election. And because they do not split the vote, I am almost guaranteed mathematically that I'll get one of my people in. And it comes down to, but is it fair? And in my opinion, with the math the way that it is unfair even if you get your vote.
Look, there's not a perfect voting system. I don't think we're sitting here and saying ranked choice voting is the end-all be-all of the perfect voting system. But it's much better than the current system we have, our plurality system. And if there's a handful of Democrats or big money people that happen to like it as well, then great, they can fund it, and they can fund a better system that is better than the current system. It's not perfect either, but it's better than the current system we have, especially as a voter. And as a voter, be able to express your preferences and who you want to support. You know, it's the consent of the governed, right? What does that even mean, the consent of the governed? But if I lost, right, because my preferences got split and now I'm being represented by somebody who doesn't represent me and my neighbors because we all cancel each other's out, that's not a good system. Ranked choice voting is better.
All right, next question. If you aren't just getting to the point, I'm going to take the microphone away.
I just had a quick question because we've heard about funding a lot, being a problem. How do you work around the SB 54? Because that's really the problem with the funding. And yeah, so that's just my question. It keeps coming up, and that's what's the funding is a big problem. So.
I think this is the ranked choice panel first.
I think your question is, how do you solve the problem with the funding because of SB 54?
Well, you guys keep bringing up the funding's the issue in like primaries, caucus, etc. That's really SB 54 as far as money paying for signature, right? It's not ranked choice voting per se. So I'm just wondering how you work around that with ranked choice voting. How do you get around SB 54?
Okay, I'm going to try to take a stab at your question. My answer to SB 54, other than to try to do away with it, was hey, ranked choice voting to solve the plurality issue in the primaries. We ended up with at the municipal level as an option for cities to try it out and see how it it's cheaper to run an election as a candidate. You can talk to a lot of candidates that run elections in ranked choice voting cities as a candidate, especially if you get to avoid the primary. And you're not running an election from what? June clear to November. It condenses it. You don't have to raise as much money. There's not signs around the city forever. So it's cheaper that way. And it's quicker. That's my time. Christie's hand is up.
All right, one vote, panel.
I don't know if I'm going to answer the question right, but I do have a comment on primaries. As somebody who has run in a nonpartisan election twice, a friend of mine and I, we beat out 2-term incumbents because of primary elections. When you don't know what you're doing, which I did not, you come out at me and say, hey, I just want my kids to learn good math. You don't know what you're doing. You can't start with big money and big candidates and big campaign managers. You don't even know, your neighbors don't even know that you're running. And you have to have the time in a primary election to knock those doors. My friend knocked 4,400 doors in Lehigh, Saratoga Springs, and Eagle Mountain in order to garner that win. And she needed the time from June, or from March actually, all the way to November, to be able to make those in-person connections. And you will lose that, and you will transfer it all to the big money, because that's how you're going to get started, boots on the ground, is with big money.
Yeah, that's it.
Just ask for clarification.
So the original Constitution actually used a form of hybrid plurality and approval-based voting, which is really great. It's really simple. You just count up the votes. There's no iteration. This was repealed. So my question is, do you favor a return to the Constitution's original plurality-based voting, plurality and approval-based system?
This is the one vote panel first. Yes.
Sorry. I would have to look into that. I don't know anything about it. I am a fan of one person, one vote.
And this is a good opportunity to talk about something that has been alluded to time and again. There is nothing that says that the all-new path to a democratic electoral outcome is a pure majority. There's nothing that says that. Abraham Lincoln would be an illegitimate president if we held that standard, right? And I don't think anyone would say that Abraham Lincoln is an illegitimate president. Pluralities work, and they work well. I actually prefer a plurality system with strong parties that encourage the parties to build big tent coalitions that talk to people, that bridge divides, and that are more stable than European-style parliamentary systems. But if you want a majority, there is a clean and simple way to do it, and that is to hold a good old-fashioned runoff that presents people with two clear choices. They can decide not to vote if they want to, but they don't have to worry about ranking candidates. They don't have to worry about ranking 50, 60, 70 candidates in numerous classes. It's just a choice between the two.
All right, bring choice panel.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those specific details, but I do think that the ranked ballot is a far easier and better way to get to a majority. You can go down some rabbit holes about some interesting ideas and even other additional voting systems that might be stronger on some criterion, but the plurality system right now, if you're only electing one person, one representative in any given moment, the plurality system is really unfair and not representative. And so, yeah, you can do runoffs, but those are really expensive. You have drop-off, like I showed, twice as much drop-off in Georgia with the runoff than even with Alaska, where there was confusion, by the way. Nick Begich, the Republican, was running for the seat that was last held 50 years. Jason talked about 50 years since a Democrat. That was his grandfather, the Democrat congressman, also named Nick Begich, before Nick ran. So a lot of Democrats actually wanted Nick Begich and then voted for Peltola, the Democrat side.
I'll pass. Okay.
Oh, can I take your spot?
No, we're done. All right. That choice, no.
That choice.
All right. I don't have my agenda in front of me.
Closing, 5 minutes, 5 minutes.
All right, closing arguments. Who went first on the opening arguments? Okay. Then you can go ahead and make your closing arguments, and then they can make theirs.
So bad ideas never go away, they just get rebranded. And we've seen that a lot over the last several years. We've got RCV, instant runoff, preferential voting, we're trying to rebrand it. RCV just happens to be the perfect vehicle to aid in the centralization of tabulating votes. It could give the left and fair vote who funds RCV the national popular vote. The national popular vote is one of two stated goals of fair vote and looks to potentially be rebranding right now too. I guess we'll find out. With RCV, do we acknowledge not only that, as the teenagers say, math does not math, but do we also acknowledge the timing of its arrival on the scene? Who is funding it, and how it's the perfect vehicle to arrive at the worst case scenario for every person who ever considered the vote sacred? We will stick to the details of the math, not mathing, but watch the larger game in all the corners of the country of RCV and ask, where is it headed, who wants it, and as ancient Latin said, cui bono, who benefits, and follow the money. Aside from the lesser of two evils argument and the misconception that RCV is a path for third parties, one main selling point has been that RCV can save cities money by eliminating the primary. This is true, but cities can also save money by canceling garbage collection, and we don't recommend that either. 3 years ago, when this idea came to our city, Utah Ranked Choice Voting denied that this was going further than local municipalities, and denied the problem of lacking checks and balances and the centralization of tabulation. But 3 years later, at the Riverton City Council meeting, one of the slides in the presentation pointed out advocating for RCV in congressional races. And again, just a reminder, this would require tabulation at the Lieutenant Governor's office. There's a bigger picture here. Not only does the algorithm create anomalies, but RCV fundamentally changes the campaigning process. It actually turns it even more into a game, and one that benefits big money, identity politics, and the Democrats. The Republican National Committee came out against ranked choice voting unanimously and calls it an attack on our system. The Salt Lake GOP did the same, and cities have spoken because 2 years ago, 23 cities used ranked choice voting. This year, only 11 of those cities renewed, and 1 has opted in. So we've got a 50% reduction from the people who have tried it. I want to live in a society where voting is as honest as possible and transparent, where elections have the ability to be recounted and audited transparently by the people, and it does not require a PhD or a cybersecurity degree. I also want elections that are closest to the people, not centralized and getting farther away from the people. For this reason, RCV, IRV, preferential voting, or whatever you want to call it, is not a valid voting methodology for the people of Utah.
Let me just add that this is a fragile moment for American democracy. Both sides, the left and the right, are primed to disbelieve the outcome of elections that they lose. And with ranked choice voting, we are proposing drafting a complicated new voting system with a black box algorithm that determines the results onto a system that people already doubt and distrust. That is a pathway that I don't want to go down. If we really want to improve the health of the democratic system, if we really want to improve the engagement of our citizens, then I think that looks a lot more like finding better candidates and talking about issues that matter, not trying to solve this by papering over our differences, which is ultimately what RCV does. It encourages candidates to be inoffensive and look nice, and then I guess argue that you have to vote for them, as we talked about yesterday, to find out what they stand for. That's not the way that we go. If we want to solve division, I think that we need to have honest debates about the things that we stand for and the things that we oppose. You know, we heard earlier about some of the history, very early beginnings of ranked choice voting, and it occurred to me that when we were going back to the 90s, the Gingrich Revolution wasn't delivered because all the Republicans stood up and looked pretty and didn't want to talk about things that were important. They said, no, we have important things that we disagree with. And that was how Republicans took control of Congress for the first time in a generation, because they had the honest debate, they stood up for what they believed in, and people went and they voted for it. We can't fix our problems by papering over them, and complicated new voting systems won't improve things. We need to look inward if we really want to fix our problems, and that's not what ranked choice voting does. So I oppose it because it makes voting harder, makes elections more complicated, and it makes them less approachable for everyday voters who just want it to be easy to vote, but also hard to cheat. Thank you. Thanks. So as a former clerk, I was involved in administering ranked choice elections. There's not a black box, there's not an algorithm. Addition and subtraction, that's the algorithm, plus and minus. It's very similar to other elections. There's just more candidates and more times that you're counting which candidate was voted for, because there's multiple rounds. There's an instant runoff of multiple rounds that's going on. In terms of the money and George Soros and all this kind of stuff, she said something about national popular vote. That was a separate reform that one of the advocacy groups, Fair Vote, was working on, and that's what Soros was helping with, was the national popular vote, not so much the ranked choice voting piece of it. But let's just get really to the heart of the matter, which is where Wendy and I agree a lot, which is concentrations of power. So first of all, when it comes to tabulation, you can tabulate locally. You count the ballots, you receive the ballots, you process the ballots, you spit out some results, and you send those results to the state, and they put all the results together. It works the same way as we do it now. You just send the data file to the Lieutenant Governor's office, which we do now, and they can add all of the votes together and figure out who the winner is of the ranked contest. You don't have to centralize the counting of the elections. But the centralization of power I want to talk about is the one that is why ranked choice voting matters the most. And it's the centralization of power that is often advocated by radical minorities. The last 100 years, the 20th century in American experience has been really marred politically, in my view, by the progressive era. And the progressive era is what brought us the federal income tax in 1913. The progressive era is what brought us central banking and the Federal Reserve in 1913. The progressive era, really a radical version of the progressive era, the communist era, is what brought us the Bolshevik revolution at the end of World War I. And I would submit to you that the human experience in modern society for the last 100 years has been marred by the progressive era. And you know who ushered in the progressive era political victories in Washington? It was Woodrow Wilson, who was elected in 1912 in a plurality election. The Republican Party was split. Former President Roosevelt was running against current incumbent President Taft in the Republican primary, and I submit to you that had they had ranked choice voting in the Republican primary, Roosevelt would have been president, and we wouldn't have seen any of the horrific progressive reforms that were brought by Wilson. Professor Dr. Ronald Pistrito, who's a professor at Hillsdale College, often writes for the Heritage Foundation, wrote a piece that reads, Wilson, the modern father of liberalism, he said, Wilson envisioned a new kind of national administration, largely removed from popular consent and charged with making the policy requisite for national progress, that could be staffed by university men like himself, as opposed to the political operators who populated the back rooms of Congress. The influence of Wilson and of the progressive era generally on policymaking today in many areas of national policy like environment, healthcare, finance, it's done primarily by agencies within bureaucracies to which Congress has delegated broad swaths of legislative authority. And what you see is that shift in Washington, D.C., that concentration of power that Wendy's talking about, that was ushered in by the progressive era, was a major hallmark of what Wilson and progressives at that time stood for. And when you think about the fundamental way that he was able to get elected in a plurality election, the system broke down. We didn't get to see what the voice of the people wanted. I think the voice of the people didn't want Woodrow Wilson. A majority voted against it. And if we didn't have Woodrow Wilson, I think the 20th century would have been significantly different. World War I would have played out differently, which would have undermined the Bolshevik Revolution, which would have undermined the creation of the Soviet Union, which would have undermined the rise of the Nazis in Germany. I mean, when you think about the 20th century, what you have is a radical minority faction of Americans who hijacked the wheels of power, concentrated authority in agencies and bureaucracies, and has given us terrible public policy. So I have no idea why liberal billionaires want ranked choice voting, because it's going to backfire on them.
We wouldn't have Obamacare if we had ranked choice voting, because many of those U.S. Senator Republicans would have won those races that were lost in pluralities because of spoiler effect from libertarian candidates. So I would tell you that the spoiler effect in elections is a big problem, and plurality victories are a big problem, and we should have majority victories, and ranked choice voting is a great way to do that. And for those reasons, I think ranked choice voting is a reform that actually at this moment in America is needed most.
Well, I'd like to thank our panels for coming and presenting. I'd also like to thank the people who asked questions, the people who helped us out, the people who came and participated in our booths. We had some terrific folks come and talk to you all before we got started. And thank the staff and folks who have helped us out here at Mountain View as well. A couple of things really quickly. We would love your feedback. So if there are things we could have done better, if you'd like to see a debate like this on another topic, we would love to get that from you. But I guess I should have paused for applause for all the people who participated. So thank you all, and we'll see you on the next one. Keep an eye on our social media.